So I've been reading this book with this guy, The Non-Alchemist, written by Michael Huemer, former guest and guy who some people think might have solved epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge and justification, whether we have them and if so, how we have them. When does something count as knowledge? How can we be justified in accepting mathematical truths, moral truths, truths about the external world? Can I trust my perceptual faculties, my memory, my ability to reason? Can I know anything at all? I wanted to share a few of my favorite parts from this book, Understanding Knowledge, in no particular order. Maybe these wouldn't be the most profound or important things to you if you read it, which you should, but they had an impact on me and my thinking. So let's start with one of the first questions everyone asks in epistemology. What is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? What philosophers typically engage in here is something called analysis. To correctly analyze a word, you have to give a set of conditions that correctly classifies things in all possible circumstances. That's why it's considered legitimate to raise all kinds of wild scenarios to challenge whether someone would know or fail to know something. You need to give conditions that preclude all counterexamples in order to successfully analyze the term. According to one famous definition, knowledge is justified true belief. As long as you have a belief that is justified and true, then you have knowledge, supposedly. Those are the three proposed conditions for knowledge. So take the proposition my cats are siblings. In order to know that my cats are siblings, I have to first, at least, believe the proposition is true. I have to think that it really is the case that my cats are siblings. And I should probably mention that belief is used fairly casually in epistemology. Outside philosophy, that term is often layered with all kinds of connotations that are absent in epistemology. For philosophers, to believe a proposition is usually just to affirm or accept it, regardless of anything else. If you think humans evolved by natural selection, then you believe that humans evolved by natural selection. If, on the basis of scientific evidence, you conclude that smoking causes cancer, then you believe that smoking causes cancer. It's not a big deal to say that you believe something in epistemology. There are no implications about faith or feelings, how you came to hold that belief, whether you strongly hold the belief or merely lean in favor of it, whether that belief is reasonable or what evidence or lack thereof supports the belief. So if we take the proposition, my cats are siblings, we have to at least believe it's true. If you think it's false that my cats are siblings, or you have no opinion on the matter, then you could never know that my cats are siblings. Second, it has to actually be true. If you think it's true that my cats are siblings, but they're in fact unrelated, then you don't know my cats are siblings. I think in order to have knowledge, you have to actually be right about the proposition in question. And you might feel that you're right, but that's a different issue entirely. The correct analysis of knowledge is not a feeling of subjective certainty. Further, it might be reasonable, given the information you have, to think that you're right, but again, that's a different issue. So it has to actually be the case that my cats are siblings, and you have to believe it is the case that my cats are siblings. For knowledge, it's necessary to at least have a true belief. So 2 conditions down, 1 to go. On to the J in JTB. A justified belief is one that is reasonable, one that it makes sense to hold, one that is likely to be true given the believer's evidence. So what if you have a true belief, but you came to hold this true belief on the basis of completely bizarre evidence and bad reasoning? In that case, you'd just be lucky to hold a true belief, since your belief is completely unjustified. I believe that smoking causes cancer. I affirm the proposition smoking causes cancer, and it happens to be true. But if you ask why I believe it, say I go on an unintelligible rant about numerology and H.P. Lovecraft. My belief might be true, but it's not justified. It definitely seems wrong to claim that I know smoking causes cancer when my belief is based entirely on a numerological reading of the Call of Cthulhu. I basically just got lucky. But if I form my belief on careful study of the relevant scientific research, then it would seem like I have a justified true belief. According to the JTB analysis, I know smoking causes cancer.
Just one small problem!
Say I want to know what time it is. So I turn to my old, big analog clock hanging on the wall. I say, how long has that been there? Why do I even have that? The clock on the wall says it's 3. so I formed the belief that it's 3 o'clock. Seems pretty reasonable to form beliefs about what time it is by looking at clocks, so I have a justified belief. Lo and behold, 3 o'clock is the correct time. However, unknown to me, the clock is broken. A broken analog clock is right twice a day, and it happens to be one of those times right now. So here I have a justified, true belief. And yet since I formed my belief by looking at a broken clock, it still seems as though I just got lucky. I have a true belief that it's 3, and I have a good justification for believing that it's 3. Looking at clocks is generally how we form our beliefs about what time it is, and that's a pretty good method. And yet I haven't escaped luck. I still just got lucky, even though I am right, and I have good reason to think I'm right. These are called Gettier cases, after the philosopher Edmund Gettier. Gettier cases show that the 3 conditions we've focused on are insufficient for knowledge. Gettier doesn't dispute that they're necessary for knowledge, they're just not sufficient. You can probably think of your own Gettier cases, and now that you know what they are, you'll actually stumble on them from time to time without looking for them. Since we haven't identified necessary and sufficient conditions free from counterexamples, we still don't have a complete analysis of knowledge. Remember, to analyze a word, we have to give a set of conditions that correctly classifies things in all possible circumstances. In response to Gettier cases, epistemologists have tried to improve the traditional definition by adding a 4th condition, modifying our notion of justification, or replacing justification with something else entirely. In response, philosophers have come up with other counterexamples. Then the definition is amended further, which then leads to more counterexamples, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to run through every analysis of knowledge that philosophers have ever offered, but there are dozens and dozens of them. Reliabilism, proper function, no false lemmas, relevant alternatives, sensitivity and tracking, defeasibility, and so on. To this day, there is no consensus on the proper analysis of knowledge. Indeed, for every analysis, there are counterexamples that most epistemologists would agree refute the analysis. So let's pause for a moment. Why can't epistemologists figure this out? For literally thousands of years, intelligent human beings all over the world have been trying and failing to define a word that we use all the time. We use the words know and knowledge like every day. Everyone knows how to use the terms, so why is it so hard to analyze them? By the way, there is an answer to this, which we'll come to in the next section. I think there are deep lessons to be drawn from the failure of analysis. But even if there is no totally successful analysis of knowledge that everyone can agree on, that doesn't mean they're all equally bad. True belief is not as good of an analysis as justified true belief, even though there are counterexamples to both. If you were to christen true belief as the right analysis of knowledge, there would be a ton of edge cases and seeming counterexamples, whereas if we decided justified true belief was the right analysis, there would be comparatively fewer edge cases. If you've got a definition of a term, you don't want there to be mostly edge cases and counterexamples. So what's the least bad analysis of knowledge? According to Humer, that would be the defeasibility theory. And this is one of those analyses that adds a 4th condition to JTB. Quote, S knows that P if and only if 1. S believes that P 2. P is true 3. S is justified in believing that P and 4. There are no genuine defeaters for S's justification for P. In this context, a defeater for S's justification for P is defined to be a true proposition that when added to S's beliefs would make S no longer justified in believing P. So that's just the JTB analysis plus the condition that there are no genuine defeaters for the justification. We should note that defeater could mean something subtly different in other contexts within epistemology. For the defeasibility analysis, what matters is that the defeater is a proposition that is true, and that would make the subject no longer justified in believing the proposition if added to their beliefs. It doesn't matter if they're actually aware of the proposition or not. It also doesn't matter if there's a false proposition that we would have good reason to accept that would undermine the justification. For the defeasibility analysis, the defeater has to be a true proposition that, if added to your beliefs, would make you no longer justified in believing the proposition. So how would this avoid Gettier cases? Well, the clock is broken is a true proposition that, when added to your beliefs, would make you no longer justified in believing that it's 3. The counterexamples to the defeasibility analysis are incredibly complicated and absurd. And that's all fair game in conceptual analysis. But still, not all analyses fail to an equal degree. The defeasibility theory isn't perfect, but it seems to accurately capture the meaning of the term while minimizing counterintuitive implications. Humer calls this, quote, the most nearly adequate analysis of knowledge. You might have thought up a couple objections to the defeasibility theory, like, how could you tell whether there were any genuine defeaters for a proposition? How could I really know that there aren't any defeaters for my justification? There may be a misconception about the purpose of analysis working in the background here. The point is not to help you decide in life whether you have knowledge. The point is to define knowledge, to provide a set of conditions that correctly classifies things in all possible circumstances. What does it mean to know something? That's what we're trying to figure out. I can't be absolutely certain that there are no defeaters, just like I can't be absolutely certain that my belief is true. I don't have an infallible truthometer in my possession, and yet I still think the T in JTB is a condition that needs to be there for the best analysis of knowledge. But maybe you're still bothered by something here. How could we ever know whether there are genuine defeaters? Even if we know something, can we know that we know it? First, arguing for a requirement of this kind of meta-knowledge leads to an infinite regress. It's enough to know. You don't need to know that you know. If it's the case that in order to have knowledge, you needed to know that you know, then you'd also need to know that you know that you know. But in order to know that you know that you know, you'd need to know that you know that you know that you know, and so on ad infinitum. The moral of the story is that it's enough just to know. So meta-knowledge can't be a requirement, knowing that one knows it, since that would lead to an infinite regress. But you might wonder, doesn't it bother you at all that you can seemingly never know whether there are genuine defeaters, and hence whether you have knowledge? Well, once again, according to the defeasibility theory, you know a proposition if you satisfy the JTB conditions plus the fourth condition on genuine defeaters. So you can know that there are no defeaters. You can know that the fourth condition is satisfied. You just need a justified, true belief, and additionally, there can't be a true proposition that, if added to your beliefs, would defeat the justification for the proposition. In this case, the proposition that there are no genuine defeaters. You can know something, and you can even know that you know it, even though it's not necessary for knowledge. If the objector still isn't happy, I would assume at this point that they're looking for something that no one can give them. They don't just want knowledge, they want certainty. But in almost all cases, you will never have absolute certainty. To quote J.L. Mackie, the demand for certainty will inevitably be disappointed, leaving skepticism in command of almost every issue. The point of analyzing knowledge is not to help me feel the warm glow of certainty, and it's also not to give me direct, practical advice like a guidance counselor. It's about understanding. Actually, as a side note, that's what most of modern analytic philosophy is about. It's not about the love of wisdom, like the ancient Greek definition. It's about understanding. Earlier, I mentioned that the defeasibility theory is considered by Humer to be the most nearly adequate analysis of knowledge. But why not entirely adequate? Why not just amend the theory so it doesn't fall prey to the admittedly convoluted counterexamples put against it? That's what leads us to the failure of analysis and a Wittgensteinian view of concepts. This next section is honestly the most exciting part to me. I don't know what that says about me, but it was something that was genuinely groundbreaking and exciting when I first learned about it, so I'm really excited to share it with you. This next part is a little difficult because it requires a certain amount of accumulated experience to really land. By that I mean you need to have seen others try and fail to define seemingly simple terms. A famous example is game. It is surprisingly hard to define a word like that, considering we use it all the time, and so must know what it means on some level. If you've never seen proposed definitions of game get shot down with counterexamples over and over again, you might not believe me and think it's really easy to define game. This is why Humer doesn't cover his view of concepts until showing us the failure of analysis with respect to knowledge. Philosophers in the 20th century tried very hard to analyze that particular term, and yet there are good counterexamples to every proposed analysis. The reason I wanted to cover this topic is exactly because I was already familiar with the difficulty of conceptual analysis, with providing a set of conditions that correctly classifies things in all possible circumstances. I already knew that it seemed impossible with philosophically interesting terms, so the section of Humer's book examining more fundamental assumptions that led to the problem jumped out at me. But if you don't occupy a position like that on the epistemic landscape, one where you can see the extreme difficulty of analysis, then this part isn't quite as groundbreaking. But I'm not going to spend a chunk of time going through a Socratic dialogue, trying and failing to analyze terms like game, cause, time, justice, and so on just to prove the point. I'll just link some resources that go through that process and take it as an assumption going forward that correctly classifying things in all possible circumstances, providing a set of necessary and sufficient conditions free from all counterexamples, is damn near impossible with philosophically interesting terms.
Well, I think philosophy got off on the wrong foot several thousand years ago when Socrates and Plato convinced people that they should look for essential properties and try to, Euclidify philosophy. Geometry was the obvious candidate for the most wonderful and perfect science there was, and the idea was to make philosophy as much like geometry as possible. And that just turns out to be a big mistake. In the real world, outside of the world of mathematics, there just aren't very many bright lines, clear edges, definitions that will stand the test of counterexamples. And philosophers for several thousand years have spent way too much time fighting over definitions and being counterexample mongers when they should take a deep breath, adopt population thinking as derived from Darwin, and recognize that this process of strict definition and proof, which is, for many philosophers, it's just what philosophy is in almost every area doomed. And they should just recognize that and revise their practice.
The actual shape of our concepts, so to speak, is fuzzy and complex, not neat and sharp and precise. Indefinability is a consequence of those fuzzy borders. The secret is that indefinability is not a problem, or more provocatively, it doesn't matter that we can't successfully define the words we use. Think about the gradual evolution of language, and about how we acquired language. Did you just sit down and study a dictionary? No, you heard others using language and you mimicked their usage. You figured out what words meant by noticing how others used them. Which came first, language or dictionaries? We were acquiring and using language long before we tried to systematically define every word we use. And how did we generate those dictionaries in the first place? We basically just consulted linguistic intuition, testing it against specific cases, which basically means imagining using it in different contexts and just seeing if it sounds right or not. Of course, it's entirely natural to think that you can only use a concept once you already know what it means, and knowing what it means requires being able to give a good definition of it. There's a view of concepts implicit in this way of approaching the issue, which Humer calls the Lockean view of concepts after John Locke. 1. Concepts are introspectively observable mental items. 2. Most concepts are constructed out of other concepts. 3. Introspection is reasonably reliable. 4. Therefore, for most concepts, we should be able to see how the concept is constructed from other concepts. This way of approaching concepts doesn't always fail. If you think about a relatively simple geometrical concept, like a triangle, we can see that triangle is composed of other concepts. 3. Straight line, closed. If you understand the concept triangle, then you can introspect and see that it involves these other concepts. In other words, the concept is constructed out of other concepts. So when it comes to philosophically interesting concepts like justice, knowledge, causation, time, and so on, we should be able to go about it in the same way, right? Well, this is what philosophers have been trying and failing to do. With the exception of some simple concepts, mathematical concepts, and technical definitions where we just stipulate what it means, analysis has not yet yielded a perfect definition of pretty much anything. In fact, if some future philosopher does correctly analyze knowledge, the definition would be so convoluted that it wouldn't be helpful to anyone who didn't already understand the word. If someone wanted to understand the term, telling them the correct definition would probably confuse them more than just giving examples of how to use it. That would be the better path to understanding. There are 3 things wrong with the Lockean view. First, understanding a word, except in rare cases, is not a matter of knowing a definition. Understanding a word is a matter of having the appropriate dispositions to use that word, being disposed to apply the word to the things that it applies to, and not apply it to the things it doesn't apply to. Accordingly, the way we learn words is hardly ever by being given a verbal description of the word's meaning. We learn almost all of our words by observing others using the words in context. We then attempt to imitate others' usage, to apply the word in circumstances that seem to us similar to those in which we have previously observed others using the word. Each time we hear the word used, that slightly influences our dispositions. You understand a given word to the extent that you can successfully imitate the accepted usage. End quote. Humer goes on to argue that concepts are generally not constructed out of other simple concepts, like in the case of triangle, and that concepts are not always introspectively observable. Understanding a word is a matter of having the appropriate dispositions to use the word. Concepts are dispositional mental states. Our main access to a concept comes, quote, not through directly reflecting on the concept, but through activating the dispositions that constitute our understanding. End quote. We can do this in real life or just in our imaginations. We imagine a situation and are inclined to use certain words and not others. This not only tracks with how we actually learned language to begin with, but also with the common method of checking definitions by consulting our linguistic intuitions. Quote, if the way we applied concepts were by applying a pre-given definition, then this methodology would be backwards. We would reject intuitions that conflict with our pre-given definitions, rather than the other way around. End quote. We don't just keep insisting that knowledge is justified true belief after we've been given counterexamples. We say, yeah, it actually seems like that person didn't have knowledge in that Gettier case. We don't say, well, actually, they did have knowledge because it satisfied our pre-given definition. This use-based way of understanding the meaning of terms is of course going to be fuzzier and more complex than a rigidly defined, geometrically precise method. Usage is messy. So there will pretty much always be edge cases, things that don't seem to quite fit on either side of a sharp line. On this view of concepts, that's to be expected. A perfectly good concept will, nonetheless, admit of borderline cases. It's not some kind of big point against the concept or your understanding of it just because there are a couple edge cases. The radical-sounding conclusion of all this is that understanding is constituted by knowing how to use a word and not by being able to provide a perfect definition. You can understand a concept without being able to provide a set of conditions that correctly classifies things in all circumstances. It's misguided and kind of pointless to get hung up on this activity of endless conceptual analysis. As Dennett said earlier, for a lot of philosophers, that just is philosophy, and it's a total dead end. Quote, indefinability of words is perfectly normal and does not pose a problem, since understanding is not constituted by knowledge of definitions. The best way to convey a word's meaning is through examples. End quote. This brings us to a particular passage I came across in Randall Rouser's book, The Doubter's Creed, How to Be a Christian When You Don't Believe It's True. I interviewed Rouser about the main subject of the book if you're interested. In attempting to define naturalism, Rouser explains the method of ostensive definition by negation. Quote, if one gives an ostensive definition of something, one defines that thing indirectly by pointing to examples that satisfy the definition. For example, you could define ball by providing a formal definition like a ball is a spherical object, though American football fans might disagree, but you could also define ball indirectly by pointing to things that satisfy the definition. a basketball, a bowling ball, a ball bearing, and so on. Second, the idea of defining something by negation involves defining it indirectly by saying what it is not. For example, you might begin to define courage by saying it isn't cowardice, it isn't weakness, and it isn't laziness. End quote. Rausser brings this up in the context of defining naturalism, which often involves ostensive definition by negation. Naturalists often describe their view by giving examples of supernatural, religious, or things otherwise deemed spooky that they don't believe in. Giving examples, including negative examples, is a good way to convey a term's meaning, showing how the word is used. Activating the dispositions that constitute understanding is more important than being able to give a dictionary-worthy definition. That is, if understanding is the aim. This isn't just the case with naturalism. It's true for most, if not all, philosophically interesting concepts. Understanding a concept is not a matter of knowing a definition. The Wittgensteinian view of concepts explains how it's possible that everyone knows how to competently use terms, even though it's so hard to successfully analyze them. I can't provide a perfect conceptual analysis of knowledge, and yet I have no issue using the term. In fact, I feel fine rejecting proposed analyses of knowledge. I reject the justified true belief analysis, since it seems wrong to say that I have knowledge of the time when I'm looking at a broken clock. Not only can I competently use terms that I can't analyze, I can reject proposed analyses as insufficient. That's because I know what the term means, despite the fact that I can't define it. You can actually make a name for yourself just through proving the point that it is hard, if not impossible, to give a perfect definition of a philosophically interesting term. If you just pop out of the bushes and demand to know the necessary and sufficient conditions free from all counterexamples of any word, you will stump a lot of people. Especially if you already know those people have edge cases at the forefront of their minds. One note on edge cases: while it's true that there will always be borderline cases, that shouldn't be abused. That fact doesn't give us free rein to define anything terribly since, hey, there will always be counterexamples and edge cases. Taxonomies are more or less useful depending on how comfortably things fit into the categories within the taxonomy. There shouldn't be mostly borderline cases. They should be few and far between. A perfectly good concept will still have some edge cases, but you don't want mostly counterexamples in edge cases. About 100 years ago, G.E. Moore suggested that we should believe things that are more plausible and not believe things that are less plausible, and he's been controversial in philosophy ever since. But before we get to the Moorean shift, let's talk about Agrippa's trilemma. The ancient skeptic Agrippa is famous for presenting a trilemma about the structure of knowledge. Say you know a proposition. I ask how you know it. You cite a reason. You know A on the basis of B. But how do you know B? Well, you know B on the basis of C. Agrippa says there are only a few ways this chain of justification and reason-giving could end. It could go on forever, an infinite regress of reasons, which doesn't seem so good. It could suddenly stop, ending at a proposition that you insist you know, or is justified, even though you can't provide any reason for it. It's just where the chain of justification ends. Or we could go in a circle. Maybe after reason F we end up back at A. You know F on the basis of A, which you know on the basis of B, and so on. But circular reasoning can't generate knowledge. It makes no difference that the circle is very large and takes a long time to go around. These three options, infinite regress, foundations, and circularity, each seem problematic in some way. So maybe, the skeptic argues, we don't actually have any knowledge. Agrippa's trilemma is really a quadrilemma, but whatever. The puzzle is to figure out how we have knowledge. not whether we have knowledge. In principle, we should be open to radical conclusions, but the idea that we don't have any knowledge is a bit out there. Whatever defense of an abstract skeptical argument you can muster, it's not going to seem more plausible than the idea that I know what 2 plus 2 equals. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to that. I also have knowledge of what it's like to see green. I know that dogs exist. That's pretty much it, but that's still a non-zero number of things I know. The Moorean shift is a type of response to a skeptical argument in which one says the argument's conclusion is so implausible that it makes more sense to reason from the denial of the conclusion to the denial of one of the premises, rather than to accept the skeptic's argument. Even if you can't see what's wrong with Agrippa's skeptical argument, for example, Moore's point is that rejecting a premise in the argument is pretty much guaranteed to be more plausible than rejecting the idea that I know how much 2 plus 2 is, or that I have hands. So here's the skeptical argument. 1. A chain of reasons must have one of 3 structures. It's infinite, it's circular, or it ends in one or more propositions for which there are no reasons. 2. You can't have an infinite series of reasons. 3. Circular reasoning can't generate justification. 4. A proposition for which there are no reasons is unjustified. 5. If a proposition is unjustified, then you can't justify anything else on the basis of it. 6. Therefore, no chain of reasons can provide justification for believing anything. Therefore, no belief can be justified. This is a valid argument, so we need to reject one of the premises to avoid the conclusion that no belief can be justified. Coherentists reject the third premise, foundationalists reject the fourth. Personally, I'm a foundationalist, which means that I think some beliefs are justified in a way that doesn't depend on reasons or other beliefs. We have some foundational beliefs that are not based on anything else, and we are nonetheless justified in accepting them. And by the way, these foundational beliefs that don't require any further reasons don't need to be indefeasible. Just because it's possible to doubt them doesn't mean they somehow can't be foundational. So, returning to the Moorean shift, consider the following 5 propositions. A. I know that I have 2 hands. B. Knowledge must be supported by reasons. C. Reasons must themselves be known. D. No one can have an infinite series of reasons. And E. Circular reasoning cannot generate knowledge. As Humer explains, quote, each of these propositions has some initial plausibility. That is, before hearing arguments for or against any of them, each of them at least sort of sounds correct. But they are jointly incompatible. They can't all be true. Therefore, we have to reject at least one of them. End quote. The skeptic thinks we should reject A, because it conflicts with B through E. But notice that we could reason like that about the rejection of any of them. We have to reject E because it conflicts with A through D. We could do that with any of the propositions. The thing is, not all of them are equally plausible. One of them in particular is more plausible than the others. So here's a dumb idea. We should reject the most plausible of the inconsistent set. Why on earth would we do that? We have to reject at least one of these, and it should obviously not be the one about having 2 hands. However plausible it is that knowledge must be supported by reasons, and reasons must themselves be known, those are not more plausible than the idea that I have 2 hands. Quote, the Moorean response can be applied to pretty much any skeptical argument. When you look at skeptical arguments, you see the same thing with all or nearly all of them. The skeptic keeps asking us to reject the most initially plausible proposition out of the inconsistent set. Prior to considering skeptical arguments, such propositions as, I know I have hands, I know how much 2 plus 2 is, and I know I exist, are pretty much maximally initially plausible. In other words, you can't find anything that more strongly seems correct. Yet those are the sort of propositions that skeptics want us to reject. Meanwhile, the skeptic's premises generally include abstract, theoretical assumptions that are much less obvious. This is the skeptic's error. And as Humer points out, it's a common feature of skeptical arguments, not just about knowledge generally, but specific kinds of knowledge, like moral knowledge. Quote, the skeptic's approach is actually the least reasonable option. The skeptic is rejecting the most initially plausible proposition out of the inconsistent set, rather than the least initially plausible one. I'll mention one more bonus error frequently committed by skeptics, and not just radical skeptics like Agrippa, but your more garden variety skeptics. The reasoning usually goes something like, it is hard to categorize certain kinds of knowledge, therefore we don't have those kinds of knowledge. Just because intuition is not really analogous to sense perception, or because abstract objects are not really analogous to concrete physical objects, doesn't mean abstract objects don't exist. That they don't fit into your categories or taxonomy is not in itself a strike against knowledge involving abstracta. Quote, when we try to formulate principles about the nature of knowledge, we tend to be guided by certain paradigms and by the examples that fit into our conceptual scheme comfortably. Thus, there may be a tendency to think that all knowledge must have certain characteristics that those examples have. This might explain some of the felt force of arguments for skepticism. For instance, a budding skeptic might start out thinking that all knowledge must consist of direct observations, certain self-evident axioms, or things deductively or inductively inferred from them. The skeptic then might notice that, say, the judgment that it is prima facie wrong to break your promises doesn't fit any of those categories, whereupon the skeptic assumes that no one can know it is prima facie wrong to break your promises. In brief, the skeptic may think the wrongness of promise breaking doesn't resemble the theorems of Euclid, so it must not be real knowledge. I suspect that something like that happens to many philosophy students, so it may be helpful to use a different set of paradigms, one that includes cases of recognitional knowledge, categorization, and judgment. You might have heard the Moorean shift usually summarized as one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. I will never say that unironically, but I wanted to explain what it means just in case you hear someone else mention it. Modus ponens is an argument of the form, if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. If the lamp is on, and working properly, etc., then there will be light. The lamp is on, therefore there is light. Modus tollens is an argument of the form, if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If the lamp is on, there will be light. There is no light, therefore the lamp is not on. Notice that it would be fallacious to argue, if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. If the lamp is on, there will be light. The lamp is off, therefore there is no light. Well, there could be other sources of light, like a candle or a flashlight. This is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Anyway, if someone gives a valid modus ponens argument, we could Moorean shift our way to a modus tollens argument. The defenders of both arguments agree that P implies Q, but one of them says that P is correct, therefore Q is correct, while the other says Q is not correct, so P must not be correct either. How this usually works in practice is one person says, hey, I've got reasons to believe P. P implies Q, so I've got reasons to believe Q. And the other guy says, hey, I've got reason to think Q is false, so that means I've got reason to think P is false. This is why Moore's response to radical skepticism is just to say, here is one hand, here is another. The idea that he knows he has hands is more plausible than any abstract argument for external world skepticism. The main point is that two people with different positions can agree on the first step of some argument, that P implies Q. One will give a modus ponens and say P, therefore Q, even though Q is something controversial and implausible. The other guy will say that not Q seems right, so we should infer, instead, that not P. We should bite the bullet of rejecting P, rather than biting the bullet of accepting Q. Of course, there's always a third way out. Reject the first premise by denying the move from P to Q. So let's go to a familiar character. Imagine there's a powerful demon capable of generating any experience in someone's mind. He's created an unembodied soul, or if you prefer, a brain in a vat, which he deceives into believing that they're an ordinary person, embodied, living on Earth, In fact, he's deceived them into believing they've lived a life exactly like the one you've lived, up until this very moment. This deceived person has had experiences exactly like the experiences that you're actually having. Their mind is identical to yours. They have the same belief system you have. Except, in their case, almost all their beliefs are false. So you probably think I'm asking, how can you be sure that you're not being deceived by the evil demon right now? But here, that's not the point. We're not talking about radical skepticism or Cartesian doubt. Rather, we're talking about the notion of justification. Quote, a justified belief is one that is reasonable, one that makes sense to hold, one that is likely to be true given the believer's evidence. This hypothetical is raised in order to ask, what would the demon's victim be justified in believing from their point of view? Well, if they have a mind that's identical to yours, living a life identical to yours, presumably they would be justified in having beliefs like yours. For example, I live in Michigan, Earth completes one rotation on its axis every 24 hours, Fox Mulder is a fictional person, dogs exist, and so on. It would obviously be crazy for you to accept right now that you're being systematically deceived by an otherworldly being, that none of the other minds you've ever interacted with have been real. Actually believing that would seem indistinguishable from a psychotic break. Shout out to Breakfast of Champions. So why would it be any different for them? Remember, we're not talking about what's true, we're talking about what's justified to believe given the information this unfortunate person has at their disposal. Regardless of whether it's true, is it reasonable for them to believe, given their base of evidence, that they live in Michigan, Fox Mulder is fictional, dogs exist, etc.? Since it makes sense for me to believe these things, I can't see how it wouldn't make sense for an exact copy of me to believe the same in the deception scenario. The purpose of the new evil demon argument is to motivate internalism about justification, as contrasted with externalism. People in these scenarios are justified in believing the same things that normal people justifiably believe. This shows that justification is a function of what's going on in one's own mind. Basically, internalists believe that knowledge requires justification. You know that P only if you're justified in believing P. And justification is internal. Externalists believe one of two things. An externalist might think either that knowledge does not require justification at all, or that knowledge requires justification, but justification need not be internal. End quote. The new evil demon case is supposed to show that justification is internal to subjects. Both the deceived and non-deceived subjects have the same degree of justification for their beliefs, since their minds are indistinguishable, even though what's going on externally is dramatically different. If two people have the same stuff going on in their minds, or the same introspectively accessible states, then they are justified in believing exactly the same propositions to exactly the same degree, regardless of what else is going on in the world around them. That's what is meant by saying justification is internal. End quote. There's one ambiguity about the word internal here. You could be an internalist who thinks that only states that are introspectively accessible to you count as internal in the relevant sense. Or you could think that if it's entirely determined by the state of your own mind, it counts as internal whether or not you have introspective access to it. There are plenty of debates in philosophy of mind that might bear on this issue, like overflow, for instance, might be relevant. But here I just wanted to mention that some internalists think you need to have introspective access to the mental state, and other internalists think that justification is solely a matter of one's own mental states, and you may or may not have introspective access to those mental states. But either way, if internalists are right, that would make sense of why someone who's lived a life identical to yours would be justified in believing all the things that you actually believe. This is true even though their beliefs were formed through the machinations of a powerful demon who is set out to deceive them, which is probably the most unreliable, non-truth-tracking belief-forming process that you could imagine. And yet, it seems like they're justified in believing exactly what you believe. Quote, there's a certain sense in which the soul should believe that it's a normal person living in the physical world. When it has the experience of seeming to see a cat on a mat, it should think there's a cat on a mat. This belief would be mistaken, but nevertheless entirely reasonable, given what the soul has to go on. Indeed, if the soul believed what is actually true, that it was a disembodied soul being deceived by an evil demon, it would be insane, just as insane as you would be if you thought that right now. End quote. The new evil demon argument for internalism is very powerful, so why on earth would anyone be an externalist? And by the way, when you use words like internalism or externalism, you should always specify what you're talking about. Internalism about knowledge and justification has been the subject so far, but philosophers love to use the terms internalism and externalism in all kinds of contexts, so you should always be specific. To reiterate, internalists believe that knowledge requires justification. If you don't have a justification for your belief, you don't have knowledge. Further, that justification is internal to one's mind, not external. Externalists either think that the justification required for knowledge is external to one's mind, or that a justification is not needed for knowledge. Certain analyses of knowledge, for example, reliabilism and proper function, don't specify justification as a condition for knowledge. In the case of proper function, you know something if you have a true belief, and that belief was formed by properly functioning cognitive faculties. Those faculties were designed to produce true beliefs, and you're in the environment they were designed for. And of course, designed can be understood in terms of evolution or a designer. Now, someone like Alvin Plantinga thinks of design in a more literal sense, but we could also speak of evolution designing us to have faculties that perform certain functions and so on. Evolutionary biologists can and do talk about design, but in the sense of teleonomy, not teleology. So, externalism is at its best in cases where we seem to have knowledge, but are unable to supply justification for our beliefs. For example, young children and animals seem to know things, and yet are unable to supply justifications for their beliefs. They are reliable detectors of certain facts, and yet there doesn't seem to be much by way of internal justification. In those cases, it seems plausible that there's some kind of process that's reliably leading them to get to the right answer, even though that process is not a matter of what's going on internally to one's own mind. It's not just young children and animals, though. We often can't give a justification for what we believe. If I ask you how many planets there are in our solar system, and you say 8, RIP Pluto, what exactly is your justification? Did you actually do any astronomy? Probably not. You used a search engine whose workings you don't understand, or as a kid, you took someone's word for it. Someone whose name you can't remember and whose reliability you never checked. These justifications suck, and yet you appear to have knowledge. You do know that there are 8 planets. So how can internalists claim that justification is internal when the justifications that are actually internal to your mind are so terrible? We seem to ascribe knowledge to subjects who are reliable detectors of certain facts, like there are 8 planets. There are internalist ways of getting around this. For example, an internalist might think that if a belief seems true to you, and there's no specific reason for doubting it, you have some justification for believing it's true. We might have been unconsciously inflating the idea of justification into something more significant than it really is. Some degree of justification might not be that hard to come by. Additionally, some internalists think externalists are sort of changing the subject. It seems like any natural sense of knowledge and justification is going to be in line with internalist thinking. How can you claim to know something if, from your own point of view, there is absolutely no justification, no reason to think it's true? Maybe internalists and externalists are just talking about different things, and humor suggests a truce in understanding knowledge along these lines. Quote, maybe internalism and externalism are both right, in a sense. Some people think there are 2 kinds of knowledge, or 2 concepts of knowledge, one externalist and one internalist. The externalist kind of knowledge, sometimes called animal knowledge, is the one we commonly ascribe to animals and children. Animal knowledge requires reliability, but does not require internal justification or knowledge of one's own reliability. The internalist kind of knowledge, sometimes called reflective knowledge, is a higher grade of knowledge that requires one to be able to justify one's belief on reflection. This is the sort of knowledge that philosophers have traditionally sought after. Internalists unambiguously have the upper hand in the new evil demon case. One person's beliefs were formed by the demon's manipulations, an unreliable process if there ever was one, but both subjects seem equally justified in holding their beliefs. This is actually an area where abstract epistemological issues bear directly on our ordinary lives. Consider the fact that you should believe that you're an embodied person living in the physical world, and someone who's lived exactly the same mental life you've lived up to this moment would also be justified in believing this, regardless of what else is going on in the world around them. This can help demonstrate something beyond internalism. A person can be rational and justified in holding a belief even if that belief is entirely false. It can be irrational to believe the truth, and it can be rational to believe what turns out to be false. I bring this up to illustrate the conceptual gap between truth and justification. There can be a temptation to think that everyone who's wrong must have actually gone wrong somewhere. They must have made a mistake in their reasoning, or else they wouldn't hold mistaken beliefs. But that just isn't the case. There has to be a conceptual divide between truth and justification, reality and rationality. In other words, even if someone is wrong, that doesn't mean they're stupid or bad at reasoning or more subject to biases or something. You can stick to your convictions about what's true without being forced to assume the worst about those who think you're wrong. In a similar vein, many seem to think that if something is true, there can be no evidence against it. And conversely, if something is false, there can be no evidence for it, or any good reason to believe it. That's just completely wrong. Reality is ambiguous. Evidential support happens all over the place. Given the base of evidence that you're working with, it might be reasonable for you to hold a belief that would be unjustified given the evidence base of a different subject. Take God's existence, even though we could choose any topic. It's entirely possible for a theist to be justified in their theism and an atheist to be justified in their atheism. Neither one is necessarily being irrational, even if we stipulate that theism is true or false.
Okay, with all that out of the way, let me say at the outset that yes, it's quite obvious that theism can be rational, and the same is true of atheism. I'm certainly not here to dispute Trent's case on that front. Whether someone is rational in believing something is a function of a huge concoction of individual specific factors, including their particular background web of beliefs, the books they've read, the papers they've read, the videos they've watched, the podcasts they've listened to, the order in which they've read and listened to these things, the experiences they've had, their precise body of testimonial evidence, their plausibility structure, or their intuitions, and countless other factors besides. This individual-specific mixture of factors situates each of us in a unique position on the grand epistemic landscape, equipping each of us with unique, sometimes incommunicable reasons for our beliefs. This also is how disagreeing parties can oftentimes each be rational, right? The parties are coming equipped with different lenses through which they see the issue, different background reasons, and more besides. It's trivially easy to find people whose unique concoction of the aforementioned factors renders it rational for them to believe in God. And it's likewise trivially easy to find people whose unique concoction of the aforementioned factors renders it rational for them to disbelieve in God. This is partly why intellectual empathy is so important. It helps you to at least approximately see things from someone else's perspective and to appreciate the other person's rationality. In turn, this helps facilitate the productive, love-oriented exchange of ideas between you and the other person. So anyway, all of this is to say that one can definitely be rational in being a theist, just as one can definitely be rational in being an atheist. Of course, those agnostics are definitionally irrational, so no love for them.
There is no belief that's simply justified, all on its own, fully separated from the subjects who hold the belief. Consider the fact that different people can have different justifications for the same true belief. Say that one justification is terrible and the other is airtight. So is that belief justified or not? Well, one person here is justified, and the other is unjustified, even though it's the same belief. Justification is dependent on persons. It's not just that justification is internal to the subject, it also changes depending on which subject we're talking about, since we don't have identical minds. It's often assumed that anyone who's wrong must have made a mistake in their reasoning, or else they wouldn't hold their false beliefs. But that just isn't the case. Even if someone is wrong, that doesn't mean that they're stupid or crazy or unreasonable. Something can be false but justified from certain perspectives on the epistemic landscape, just as something can be true but unjustified. Maybe you should give them the benefit of the doubt and be patient. If you want them to give you the benefit of the doubt, then you should do the same rather than assuming that they're crazy because they hold a position that you think is crazy. You might think some of this is obvious, but if everyone already knows this, then it sure is weird that so few people act as if they know it. We don't all have identical minds, so if justification is a matter internal to one's mind, then that means different subjects can rationally come to conflicting beliefs. What are we supposed to do with that information? Well, for one, I hope it would cause everyone to calm down a bit and give others the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they disagree with you because they've seen something that you haven't seen, and vice versa. You don't even need to assume they're being irrational in order to disagree with them. We should try to understand others, try to see what they see, try our best, in as much as it's possible, to empathetically occupy their position on the epistemic landscape and appreciate why they believe as they do. We can treat one another as epistemic peers and help each other. When I come to hold a new position, it feels as though I've seen something. When I try to make arguments and provide my reasoning, I'm trying to help others see what I've seen. We should be open to them doing the same for us. With that in mind, I'd like to end with some words from Spinoza, who I think provides a good ideal to strive towards. I've made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them. We touched briefly on foundationalism. My favorite form of foundationalism is called phenomenal conservatism, which I interviewed Humer about a while back, so do check that out if you want to learn more about it. But the parts of understanding knowledge dedicated to phenomenal conservatism are going to be a lot more thorough, which is especially relevant if you think you have some devastating objection to it. There are so many interesting things we didn't even begin to talk about. Why simplicity is or isn't a theoretical virtue, trusting memory, trusting experts, Bayesianism, moral knowledge, scientific knowledge, religious knowledge, peer disagreement, and a million other things we didn't touch on. I'm interested in this set of subjects because epistemology is relevant to pretty much every other area of philosophy and science, and the book is a fantastic way to go deeper into the crucial subject of epistemology. And one note on the book, Professor Humer decided to self-publish, even though he's been published by major academic presses in the past. Quote, most epistemology books from traditional publishers are $30 to $60, even for ebooks. The ones that are intended as textbooks are especially expensive. By self-publishing this one, I can keep the price reasonable. I can also write in a more friendly and less turgid style, which traditional publishers wouldn't like. I got it for $20 online. In addition to being a great book, I think it's cool that he made a deliberate effort to sidestep the forces at work in publishing that make books and academic articles prohibitively expensive for anyone who doesn't have a university login. So with that, make sure to check out my epistemology playlist in the show notes. Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll see you next time.